Some of these men had everything: fame, money, power, and they still lost control of their own lives. Addiction, scandal, moments that almost ended everything. But here's what makes these stories different. They didn't just come back, they changed. Not because they wanted to, but because they had nothing left to hold on to, except one thing: faith. And once you see what they went through, you start to wonder, what does it actually take for someone to turn their life around completely? 15 stories, but not all of them start the way you think. 15. Tommy Lee Jones. Most people know Tommy Lee Jones as the man who never seems shaken, the calm U.S. Marshal in The Fugitive, the no-nonsense agent in Men in Black. On screen, he always looks like he understands the world exactly as it is, but long before any of that, he was asking very different questions. While studying at Harvard, Jones didn't just focus on acting or politics like many of his peers. He wrote his senior thesis on the work of Flannery O'Connor, a writer known for exploring faith, grace, and the uncomfortable ways belief collides with human weakness. Her stories weren't clean, they were violent, complicated, and they stayed with him. Years later, when Jones directed The Three Burials of Melquiades Estrada, critics noticed something unusual. It wasn't just a Western. It was a story about redemption, told in a way that felt deeply personal. But Jones never turned that into a public identity. He didn't go on talk shows to explain his beliefs. He kept it quiet, and for most of his life, that was enough, until it wasn't. Because in early 2026, Jones faced something no amount of success can prepare you for. He lost his daughter, Victoria, at the age of 34. And suddenly all those ideas about faith weren't ideas anymore. They were real. He once said that belief is something that moves people, sometimes to survival. And maybe that's what it becomes in moments like this. Not something you fully understand, but something you hold on to when there's nothing else left to hold. If you feel like he turned to the right place in his hardest moment, you can say, Amen. 14. Denzel Washington. For someone like Denzel Washington, success was never the question. 2 Academy Awards, decades at the top of Hollywood, the kind of career most actors spend a lifetime chasing and never quite reach. From the outside, it looks complete. But for Denzel, that was never the center, because long before the recognition, there was something else shaping his life. He was raised around faith, not as an idea, but as something lived, something present in everyday life. And even as his career grew, that foundation never really disappeared. It just became quieter, less visible, but still there, until the moments came when success alone didn't feel like enough. Because no matter how far you go, there are still questions success can't answer. About purpose, about direction, about who you are, when everything slows down. And for Denzel, those questions always led him back. Not to fame, not to achievement, but to something steadier. He's spoken about it over the years. Not in a way that feels forced. Not in a way that asks for attention. Just direct, clear. Put God first. That's it. No long explanation. No complicated philosophy. Just a belief that everything else comes after. And maybe that's what makes it different. Because for some people, faith shows up after everything falls apart. But for others, it's the reason they don't fall apart in the first place. 13. Matthew McConaughey. Matthew McConaughey never looked like someone searching. Confident, relaxed, in control. The kind of presence that makes everything feel easy, even when it isn't. And for a while, that was his reality. He became one of the most recognizable leading men in Hollywood. Romantic comedies, box office success. The kind of career that keeps moving forward, as long as you don't stop. But that was the problem, because at some point, the roles started to feel the same. The stories, even more. And instead of pushing forward like everyone expected, he made a different decision. He stepped away. At the height of his career, he walked away from Hollywood for nearly 2 years. No films, no spotlight, just distance. And in that silence, the questions changed. Not about success, about meaning, about who he was, without the roles people recognized him for. He spent time traveling, writing, filling notebooks with thoughts about life, and what actually matters. And when he came back, the shift was obvious. Dallas Buyers Club, Interstellar. Not just better performances, different choices, more deliberate, more personal. He never tried to define it too clearly, never framed it as religion. But he spoke about belief, about trust, about something guiding the path, even when it doesn't fully make sense. And maybe that's what it looks like for some people. Not a single moment of change, but a quiet decision. To stop chasing everything outside and start listening to something deeper within. 12. Sean Astin. Sean Astin's story doesn't begin with a collapse. It begins with something quieter. For most of his life, faith was there, close enough to notice, but not always something he held on to. He grew up around it, influenced by it. But like a lot of people, it stayed in the background until something unexpected brought it closer. He became Samwise Gamgee, a character built on loyalty, sacrifice, and the belief that even the smallest person can carry something greater than themselves. At first, it was just a role, a performance, but over time, it started to feel like more than that, because the world of the Lord of the Rings wasn't just fantasy, it was shaped by deeper ideas, faith, suffering, redemption. And living inside that story for years began to change how he saw things. Not all at once, but gradually. Astin has said that belief, for him, isn't about fitting into a system. It's not about appearances. It's something personal, something that shows up in the quiet moments, in the way you treat people, in the way you choose to forgive, and one moment stayed with him more than anything else. Reading Genesis to his daughter. Not as a debate, not as something to analyze, but as a story. And for the first time, it connected. Not intellectually, emotionally. And maybe that's how it happens for some people. Not through arguments, but through moments that make something feel real. 11. Vince Vaughn. For most people, Vince Vaughn is the guy who never takes anything too seriously. Fast-talking, quick-witted, always one step ahead of the moment. The kind of energy that keeps everything light, no matter the situation. And for years, that was the version people expected, and the one he kept giving them. Because in Hollywood, once people know who you are, they don't always want to see anything different. But something about that started to shift, not through a scandal, not through a breakdown, but through a story he couldn't ignore. When Vaughn joined Hacksaw Ridge, he stepped into a film based on the life of Desmond Doss, a man who refused to carry a weapon, even in the middle of war, a soldier who walked into violence without becoming part of it, and somehow walked out saving lives. It wasn't just another script, it was a challenge to everything people assume about strength, because strength usually looks loud, forceful, but this was different, quiet, uncompromising. And when you spend that much time around a story like that, it starts to stay with you, not as entertainment, but as a question. What do you actually believe? What would you stand for? If it cost you something real? And when Vaughn was asked about faith, his answer wasn't dramatic. It wasn't rehearsed, just honest. He said he knows how little he understands, and that he's open to something more. Open to the idea that life isn't just about what you can see or control. And maybe that's where it begins. Not with certainty, not with answers, but with the willingness to admit you don't have all of them. 10. Chris Pratt. Chris Pratt didn't start at the top. Far from it. Before the movies, before the recognition, he was living out of a van in Hawaii. No real plan, no clear direction, just getting through each day. One step at a time. And for a while, that felt like enough, because when you don't have much, you don't expect much either. But life has a way of moving you forward, whether you're ready or not. Small roles turned into bigger ones. Opportunities started to appear. Slowly, then all at once. parks and recreation, then Guardians of the Galaxy. And suddenly, everything changed. The kind of success that happens fast, after years of being overlooked. But the moment that shaped him the most didn't come from any of that. It came from something personal. When his son was born prematurely, the situation was uncertain, fragile, the kind of moment where nothing feels guaranteed, and for the first time, he found himself praying. Not casually, not out of habit, but because there was nothing else to hold on to. He later said he made a promise that if his son made it through, he would live differently, more intentionally. And his son survived. And something shifted. Not overnight, not perfectly, but clearly. Pratt began speaking more openly about faith, about gratitude, about the idea that everything he had could be taken away just as quickly. And maybe that's what changed his perspective. Because when you come close to losing something that matters, everything else starts to look different. And maybe that's where belief begins for some people, not in comfort, but in the moment. They realize how little control they actually have. 9. Mark Wahlberg. Mark Wahlberg's story didn't begin with success. It began with consequences. Real ones. Growing up in Boston, he got involved in violent incidents that led to arrests and time behind bars while he was still young. The kind of past that doesn't fade easily. The kind people don't forget. And for a long time, that was the story attached to his name. Not potential, not talent, just mistakes. But change didn't come all at once. It never does. It started quietly, with small decisions, different choices, a willingness to stop going in the same direction. And slowly, things began to shift. Music opened one door, acting opened another, and over time, he built a career that no one would have predicted. But the real change wasn't just in what he achieved, it was in how he lived. Because Wahlberg didn't try to erase his past, he acknowledged it, spoke about it, and used it as a reminder of how easily things can go the wrong way. He's talked openly about discipline, about structure, about waking up early, not just to work, but to pray, not occasionally, consistently. Because for him, faith isn't something separate from life. It's part of how he stays grounded, part of how he stays focused. And maybe that's what makes his story different, because for some people, change is about starting over. But for him, it's about staying on the path, every single day, knowing how easy it would be to fall off it again. If you feel like that kind of change is real and worth holding on to, you can type Amen below. 8. Jim Carrey. At one point, Jim Carrey had everything: fame, money, recognition on a global level. In a single year, he became one of the biggest stars in the world. Ace Ventura, The Mask, Dumb and Dumber. 3 massive hits, back to back. And suddenly, he was everywhere. The kind of success people spend their whole lives chasing. But behind all of it, something didn't feel right. Because once you reach that level, there's a question you can't avoid. Now what? Carrey has said that getting everything he ever wanted was the moment he realized it wasn't enough. Not the money, not the fame. None of it answered the deeper questions. And over time, that realization started to change him. He stepped away. Not completely, but enough to create distance, to think, to look inward. And what he found wasn't something he could easily explain. He spoke about consciousness, about identity, about the idea that the version of ourselves we chase isn't always real, and that chasing it can leave you feeling more lost than before. It wasn't a traditional path, not a clear conversion, but it was a shift, from chasing everything outside to trying to understand what's happening inside. And maybe that's where it begins for some people, not with answers, but with the realization that everything you thought would fulfill you doesn't. 7. Anthony Hopkins. There was a time when Anthony Hopkins was losing control of his life. Not in a way people could easily see, but in a way he couldn't ignore. Alcohol had taken over. What started as something casual became something constant, something he relied on, just to get through the day. And the longer it continued, the harder it became to stop, until one night, everything caught up with him. He found himself behind the wheel, drunk, with no clear memory of how he even got there. And in that moment, something shifted, not dramatically, but clearly. He realized he couldn't keep going like that. That same night, he went to a gathering in Beverly Hills, found his former agent, and said 3 words, "I need help." It sounds simple, but for him, it was a turning point. Days later, he walked into an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting. At the time, Hopkins didn't believe in God. Not at all. But during that meeting, someone asked him a question. Why don't you just trust God? And his answer wasn't complicated. He thought about it and said, why not? That moment didn't look like much from the outside, but it changed everything. He stopped drinking, and he never went back. Decades passed, and he remained sober. Not because life became easier, but because something inside him had changed. He's spoken about gratitude, about waking up each day, and recognizing it as a gift, something he never used to notice before. And maybe that's what real change looks like sometimes. Not loud, not dramatic, just one decision that leads to another, until your entire life moves in a different direction. If something about his story stayed with you, you can simply say, Amen. 6. Ben Affleck. From the outside, Ben Affleck had already reached the kind of success most actors spend their lives chasing, an Academy Award early in his career, leading roles, a name people recognized instantly. The kind of life that looks stable, complete. But behind all of that, something wasn't holding together, because success doesn't always fix what's underneath. For Affleck, alcohol became a way to cope. At first, it didn't look like a problem. Something social, something controlled, something he could step away from whenever he wanted, until it wasn't. Over time, it became something heavier, something that followed him, even when he tried to ignore it. Rehab, relapse, the same cycle, repeating itself, again and again. And no matter how many times he tried to manage it, it kept coming back, until one moment cut through everything else. He's spoken about a night when his daughter saw him, not as an actor, not as someone successful, but as a father, completely out of control. And that was the moment that stayed with him. Not the headlines, not the damage to his career, but that, because some moments don't just hurt, they force you to see yourself clearly, without excuses. And once you see it, you can't go back to not knowing. Affleck has been honest about what came after. That recovery isn't simple. That it doesn't move in a straight line. That progress can feel invisible, even when you're trying. And that faith, for him, isn't something perfect or fully defined, but it's there. Something he returns to, especially when things feel unstable. Something that reminds him to slow down, to stay present, to focus on what actually matters. And maybe that's what makes his story real. Because for some people, change doesn't happen in a single moment. It happens in the decision to keep showing up, even after failing, even after starting over, more than once. 5. Robert Downey Jr. There was a time when it looked like Robert Downey Jr.'s story was already finished. Not because of one mistake, but because of too many, stacked on top of each other. Substance abuse, arrests, court appearances that kept coming back, the kind of headlines that don't fade, the kind that slowly close every door, and eventually, prison. For an actor who had once been seen as one of the most promising talents of his generation, it felt like everything had collapsed. Studios stopped taking risks on him, projects disappeared, and for a while, it didn't seem like there was a way back. Because rock bottom doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes, it just feels final. But somewhere in that period, something began to change. Not all at once, not perfectly, but step by step. He got clean. He rebuilt his life, slowly and deliberately. And when opportunities started to return, he treated them differently. more carefully, more intentionally, until one role changed everything. Iron Man. At the time, it wasn't the obvious choice. In fact, it was a risk. But that risk became one of the biggest turning points in modern Hollywood. Not just for the industry, but for him. Because what followed wasn't just success, it was consistency, proof that change had actually happened. And maybe that's what makes his story stand out. Because it isn't about pretending the past didn't exist. It's about showing that it doesn't have to define you forever. That even after everything falls apart, there can still be a way forward. And if you've ever been in a moment like that, you don't have to say much, just amen. 4. Brad Pitt. There was a time when Brad Pitt seemed to have everything people associate with success: fame, money, recognition on a global scale. The kind of life that looks complete from the outside. But for him, it didn't feel that way. Because even at the height of his career, something was missing. Pitt has spoken about feeling disconnected, not from his work, not from his success, but from something deeper. A sense that none of it was answering the questions that actually mattered, and for a long time, he tried to ignore that feeling, focused on the next project, the next role, the next version of success that might finally feel different. But it never did, until everything around him started to break down. The divorce, the public scrutiny, the tension within his family, and behind it all, a struggle he could no longer control. Alcohol. What once felt manageable became something constant, something that followed him into every part of his life, until he reached a point where continuing the same way was no longer possible. He entered recovery, not for the headlines, not as a statement, but because he had to. And in that process, something began to shift. Not all at once, not dramatically, but honestly. He started speaking differently, less certainty, more reflection, about belief, about connection, about the idea that there might be something more, even if he couldn't fully explain it yet. He once described himself as someone who had moved away from faith, only to find himself slowly coming back, not in a straight line, but in moments, in conversations, in the quiet realization that everything he had built wasn't enough to hold him together. And maybe that's what it looks like for some people, not a single turning point, but a gradual return after realizing everything else eventually runs out. 3. Shia LaBeouf. For a long time, Shia LaBeouf's life felt like it was coming apart. Not quietly, but in public. Arrests, controversies, moments that kept making headlines for the wrong reasons. And the more it happened, the harder it became to separate the actor from the chaos. Because at some point, it stopped looking temporary. It started to feel like a pattern, something that kept repeating no matter what he did. And for a while, it didn't look like anything was going to change, until something unexpected entered his life. A role, not a major franchise, not something designed to succeed. A small film about faith, Padre Pio, a story about a man who lived through suffering and never let go of what he believed. At first, it was just work, a distraction, something to focus on, instead of everything else falling apart. But over time, that changed, because the deeper he went into the role, the harder it became to ignore what it was asking of him. About guilt, about responsibility, about whether real change was even possible, after everything that had already happened. And somewhere in that process, something shifted. Not for the audience, not for attention, but internally. LaBeouf began studying the faith behind the character, spending time with priests, not performing, listening, asking questions he had never taken seriously before, trying to understand something he had spent most of his life ignoring. And eventually, he made a decision that surprised a lot of people. He converted to Catholicism, not as a statement, not to fix his image, but because something about it felt real. Because for the first time, he wasn't trying to escape his past. He was trying to face it, to sit with it, and to find a way through it. instead of around it. And maybe that's what makes this story different, because it doesn't begin with success. It begins with breaking, with losing control, and being forced to ask if anything can still come after that. If you believe people can truly change, even after losing control of their own lives, you can say, Amen. 2. Russell Brand. For most of his life, Russell Brand wasn't searching for faith. He was avoiding it. Fast, loud, a life built on excess, addiction, arrests, relationships that didn't last, a persona that didn't take anything too seriously, especially not belief. And for a long time, that was enough. Because as long as everything was moving, he didn't have to stop, didn't have to think, didn't have to feel what was underneath. But that only works for so long, because eventually, everything catches up, and when it does, there's nowhere left to go. For Brand, that moment didn't come on stage. It didn't come in front of an audience. It came in a hospital room. His infant son needed emergency heart surgery, a long operation, an outcome no one could guarantee. The kind of moment where nothing you've built, nothing you've said, means anything. And for the first time, he had no control, no distraction, no way to talk his way out of it, just waiting. And in that silence, he reached for something he had spent years rejecting. The Bible, not as a curiosity, not as an idea to debate, but as something to hold on to. Because when everything else falls away, you don't look for what sounds smart. You look for what feels real. And something about it reached him. Not intellectually, personally. He later described it as something that met him in a place nothing else ever had. And when his son survived, that moment didn't disappear. It stayed. Brand began to change. Not instantly, but noticeably. Less performance, less irony, more honesty, more openness, to the idea that there might be something greater than himself. He was baptized, and the same voice that once mocked everything started speaking about faith, directly, without hiding it. And maybe that's what makes this story so striking, because it doesn't come from theory. It comes from a moment where everything is out of your hands, and you realize you were never in control to begin with. 1. Kanye West. There has never been a simple version of Kanye West. From the very beginning, he wasn't just making music, he was shaping culture. Albums that changed the sound of a generation, a presence that was impossible to ignore. And at the center of it all was certainty. The belief that he knew exactly who he was and where he was going. But over time, that clarity started to shift. The pressure didn't slow down. The expectations didn't disappear. If anything, they only grew. And slowly, the public began to see something different. Moments that felt unpredictable, hard to explain, sometimes brilliant, sometimes difficult to understand. And somewhere in the middle of all that, something else began to surface. Not quietly, directly. He started talking about faith, not as an idea, not as a background influence, but as something central. His music changed. His message changed. Even the way he spoke about himself began to change. For some people, it felt real. For others, it felt confusing. And maybe that's the point. Because not every story of change is clean. Not every transformation makes sense. From the outside, some of them are messy, unfinished, still happening. And that's what makes this one different. Because it doesn't give you a clear answer. It leaves you with a question. What does change actually look like? When it's still unfolding in real time, is it quiet, or is it exactly this? Imperfect, unpredictable, but real? If you believe even the most complicated journeys can still lead somewhere meaningful, you can say it quietly. Amen. 15 men, 15 different stories. Some loud, some quiet, some broken in an instant, others changed over time. But all of them reached the same place, when everything else stopped working. Not fame, not success, not control, something deeper. Because sometimes, it's not about losing everything, it's about realizing what was never enough to begin with. And maybe that's the question behind all of this. Not what happened to them, but what happens to us when life doesn't go the way we planned. Do we keep running? Or do we finally stop and look for something real? If even one of these stories spoke to you, take a moment, reflect,